It's the boy Blackbeard Mirage. I'm back. What's happening? Salute. Time for some more Aboriginal American history. And hopefully you had a pretty good day today. What I want to do in this tape is yesterday we talked about North American indigenous people and how we need to stop letting people come into our culture. And what this does is it ends in us having our identity stolen and we end up being abused and confused. Okay. So when you let people come into your culture, they're going to amalgamate into your stuff. They're going to switch identities. And then the original person is going to be left there sitting there looking stupid. And they will be abused and confused. And they will be ashamed. Okay. And that is the position that we have been in as, North Americans. Okay. We are the people who, are the first class citizens, but we've been living as second class citizens. But more importantly, in this tape, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we've been spending so much time trying not only to figure out who it is that we are, but then some of us even go a little step further and we want to run to foreign people and try to, express to them and get them to confirm who it is that we say we are. So what we're going to do in this tape is I want to go over the sacred text dealing with King Solomon. Okay. The sacred text dealing with King Solomon. So what we're doing is we're going to deal with some of the esoteric mysticism of the Hebrew culture or the Hebrew Kabbalistic system. All right. So we're dealing with some occult Hebrew science. That's what we're dealing with ultimately. But everybody as an Aboriginal indigenous person on North American soils right now who have been denationalized and you have had your identity stolen and you are walking around in the position of the beggar. So this tape also will be dedicated to all the Aboriginal brothers that you all see that are in the position of the beggar. I am one of them myself. We are men who don't produce and manufacture our own stuff. We're constantly having to ask somebody for a job, constantly having to ask somebody to help finance our ideas. And even when we go and do things on our own, it only gets so far until we got to go to somebody else and ask them to either help us with something or collab with us on something. And part of this curse that's on us is having the identity stolen. So we are all victims of identity theft. It's been a massive white collar crime under the category of identity theft. And we've been dealing with that. So that is part of the reason why we, are suffering. So what I'm going to do is read into where King Solomon had to deal with this same thing. And we all know about, King Solomon, the mystical character of the Old Testament. But, this is a very, very important lesson that we could learn from because King Solomon, basically through some of his sins, through some of his egoism and from his own carnal self and his carnal desires, and basically him not staying along with the code, not following the commandment. Usually whenever some kind of a rule or a code has been put in place, it's typically to keep things balanced. Okay. Now I know it can be hard when you have to follow rules that were not created by you. And I can understand when you rebel against those forms of rules. But honestly, when you create rules for yourself, or let's say if you have a community of people and you all create rules for yourself, then you got to follow those rules, because if not, it's like, well, damn, like how are we going to create these guidelines and standards for ourselves, which are going to protect us. But then when we don't follow them, shit hit the fan and all of a sudden we looking foolish. So, as Aboriginal people, we've done that. And that's the same thing that King Solomon did. So, so go ahead and get this straightened in your head. A lot of you all know about that Old Testament and the Bible. And you know that a lot of those are allegorical stories, but just keep in mind that a lot of that stuff is talking about the history, and it is using archetypal symbols, but it is also talking about a certain history, dealing with a certain people. Now, to prove my point, most of us know about the history of the so-called harems. Okay. The so-called, harems that the men had of different kingdoms around the world. All right. So, people know about the so-called Moors having harems. But just to be all the way 100 with you, all men of any kind of power, at some point in time in history, they all played into this, this system. And King Solomon did the same thing. Now, the issue is that when King Solomon did it, it was breaking a particular code that was set within his own community. And we'll see, what I mean by that in a minute. But this is why he got hurt. And this is why he got stung by it. So as Aboriginal men, you got to remember that, it's certain things that we just probably not going to be able to do that maybe other people can get away with. What that may be, who knows? But the point is that sometimes, people say, well, the white man was doing this, or, oh, the Asian man can do this, or, oh, the Latino man can do this, which may be true. For example, like a lot of them may try to get a certain business loan and it may be a little easier, but it's just certain things that you may not necessarily be able to do like that. So, it's certain codes you got to just follow. And when you go outside of these codes, as I said before, shit usually hits the fan. So we're going to read into King Solomon. And then we'll go into his test with Asmodeus, the king of demons, okay? Because we all know that King Solomon had the task of building the perfected temple of Israel, but he had to go through some particular trials and tribulations to do so. Also, before, I've told you all about a story regarding King Solomon when he had to basically abstain from sex and he had to live as a poor man, all right? And I was explaining also how this, ties into the Aboriginal man, because a lot of us, because our whole, system and our whole union as a group of men, it has been fractured, and we haven't really been able to back each other up, when it comes to a lot of just advancing in life. So, as individuals, it's been a little harder. And part of that, little thing that's on us is the same thing that you're going to see in this King Solomon tape. So I know I was kind of saying a lot, but I wanted to just kind of give somewhat of an introduction into what we're going into. Basically, the moral of the story is we dealing with, a story with King Solomon, basically, who was once a king. But when he, broke his own rules, he had to become a peasant or a beggar. And it's the same way with the Aboriginal North American. We were once living as kings and queens. But when we broke our own rules, now we're in the position of being beggars and peasants. So let's look in King Solomon's story and see how this correlates with what we are currently going through. So if you want to look into what I'm reading, just go and Google King Solomon and Asmodeus. King Solomon and Asmodeus, and it's tons of links, but this is just a story that is an esoteric story that goes in the system of Judaism, all right? When Solomon in his wealth and prosperity grew unmindful of his God, and contrary to the injunctions laid down for the kings in the Torah, multiplied wives upon himself, and craved the possessions of many horses and much gold, the book of Deuteronomy stepped before God and said, Lo, O Lord of the world, Solomon is seeking to remove a yod from out of me. For thou did right. The king shall not multiply horses upon himself or unto himself, nor shall he multiply wives to himself, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. But Solomon has acquired many horses, many wives, and much gold and much silver. Hereupon God said, As thou livest, Solomon, and 100 of his kind shall be annihilated. A single one of thy letters shall be obliterated. So let's go through what this means. So first you have right here, we all know about King Solomon, who was living in a very, very lavish, plush lifestyle. Because there was a point in time where Aboriginal people were living this way. It's very, very hard to notice now. It even is hard for me to notice that sometimes. When I read these things in these books and it talks about all the gold and stuff we had, but I, may be struggling to just pay a fucking bill or some shit like that. Sometimes it's very, very hard for me to believe this stuff, but, I just read it and kind of keep it moving. But anyway, King Solomon was living in the lap of luxury and prosperity, but he, started to go into ego, and he maybe got away from some of his own spirituality or some of the things that kept him once grounded. So it was also said that in the book of Deuteronomy, there were certain codes laid down for the kings in the Torah, and these kings were basically, forbidden to, long story short, have greed. Okay. It was saying that, that the king shall not multiply horses unto himself, multiply wives to himself, and shall not greatly multiply silver and gold. But King Solomon had acquired many horses, many wives, and much silver and much gold. So basically he got into greed. So maybe having a little bit of gold and silver, probably that was enough for the kingdom, for them to trade and have resources to back up whatever it is they're doing. I'm pretty sure that the spirit, knew that they needed that and that was okay. But maybe King Solomon got into greed, and maybe even some of that, maybe some of the people started to maybe even go into other areas and try to take gold and resources from other people. Let's think about the so-called Egyptian empire. Do you think that when those people had all that gold and all those resources, do you think that it all came from their land? Of course not. Some of it was, taken from other lands that they had conquered, and although they may have traded with some people, but not everybody was trading with them. So the point is that some of the resources that King Solomon had acquired, who knows, if these were even gained by legitimate means, Also, it says that he acquired many wives. Now, we also know in the Bible where it talks about King Solomon and all these strange wives that he had. And he had these wives from these different strange lands. And he had wives where basically they came from lands that worship different, forms of spirituality that he did. So in order to keep the, nation of Israel spiritually pure and spiritually chaste, one of the things that, was very, very important is that, they didn't want them accepting, women from other nations that came from communities with these weird gods, these weird outside gods, because it would pollute the minds of the men. And this would lead to, of course, the whole empire falling. We've seen this multiple times throughout the Old Testament. I don't even have to name. You can just choose a story and you'll find one. But nevertheless, this is some of the stuff that King Solomon did. OK, so when you have women coming in with these strange gods from these strange communities, this started to muddy up some of the politics probably within Israel. So this kind of, reminds me of these so-called Moors. Now, this is another thing you got to remember, too. Although you did have some of the harem stuff going on here, I'm not going to say you didn't. But I noticed that a lot of women, so-called black women or Aboriginal women, a lot of them have an issue with the whole harem thing and the Moors and all that. But what you got to remember is that was a situation that was going on more so on the coast of Africa, in the Levant or the so-called Middle East and around Europa. The phenomena was going on here, but it wasn't practiced like that. So, you did have some Aboriginal tribes here who had, some little Caucasian slaves and stuff like that. But it wasn't as prevalent as some of you all may think. So that harem culture wasn't as big here in the Americas. You did have, of course, your prostitution houses, your brothels and stuff like that. I'm not saying you did it. But as far as the concept of the harem that most of you all are familiar with, that wasn't going on over here like you may think. OK, not like you may think. So but either way it goes, though, you did have you had these practices of basically taking these women in from these strange lands. So all this led to King Solomon's higher self, realizing that he needs to basically be humbled, and he needs to, lose some of his resources for a while so he can realize what the real deal is. And as Aboriginal men, you can definitely see how this has happened to us. Now in this story, King Solomon lost his resources for about 3 years. But with us, it's been, God knows how long. Like I said, I can't even remember. I know, of course, my lifetime, it hasn't been a time where Aboriginal man had stuff. But it's even, brothers that's 100 years old. It's a brother since around today that's 100 years old. And even in his lifetime, it's never been like that. So it's quite bad when it comes to us, and quite exaggerated. And really no book could even symbolize the shit that we've been through. But nevertheless, it's at least a symbol for this. So now King Solomon, is being, about to be chastised. So then King Solomon goes on to, realize that he has these charges on him and there are going to be some consequences. So now he has to go on and try to build the temple. OK, he has to build the temple. The charges made against King Solomon were soon followed by consequences. He had to pay heavily for his sins. It came about in this way. While Solomon was occupied with the temple, He had a great difficulty in devising ways of fitting the stone from the quarry into the building, for the Torah explicitly prohibits the use of iron tools in erecting an altar. The scholars told him that Moses had used the shamar, the stone that splits rocks, to engrave the names of the tribes on the precious stones of the ephod worn by the high priest. Solomon's demons could give him no information as to where the shamar could be found. They surmised, however, that Asmodeus, king of demons, was in possession of the secret, and they told Solomon the name of the mountains on which Asmodeus dwelt, and described also his manner of life. On this mountain there was a well from which Asmodeus obtained his drinking water. He closed it up daily with a large rock and sealed it before going to heaven, where he went every day to take part in the discussions in the heavenly academy. Thence he would descend again to earth in order to be present, though invisible, at the debates in the earthly houses of learning. Then, after investigating the seal on the well to ascertain if it had been tampered with, he drank of the water. So King Solomon's consequence came when he was, going to do his duties in building the temple. But, he realized that he couldn't use stone tools, or rather iron tools to, work with building the temple. And this, created a problem with him. So King Solomon had a fleet of demons that worked for him. And they told him, like, look, we can't really help you with this, but the king of us, who is Asmodeus, if you go to him, maybe he can help you. So what ends up happening is King Solomon sends a crew of his men to Asmodeus to capture him. And they go through this process of capturing Asmodeus. And of course they do. So on the return to King Solomon, you have Asmodeus bound by these chains with the holy words of the Most High written on them. So that's actually why Asmodeus is bound. But eventually he will confront King Solomon. All right. So then it says, although Asmodeus was captured only for the purpose of getting the shamar, Solomon nevertheless kept him for the completion of the temple. One day the king told Asmodeus that he did not understand wherein the greatness of the demons lay, if their king could be kept in bonds by a mortal. Asmodeus replied that if Solomon would remove his chains and lend him the magic ring, he would prove his own greatness. Solomon agreed. The demon stood before him with one wing touching heaven and the other reaching the earth. Snatching up Solomon, who had parted with his protecting wing, he flung him 400 parsecs away from Jerusalem, and then palmed himself off as the king. So what ended up happening is after Asmodeus was captured, they brought him back to Jerusalem to talk to King Solomon. So after they finished building the temple, King Solomon, was checking out Asmodeus and was asking him, like, well, how are you this great demon if I was able to bound you? Where do your powers lie at? Now, this demon actually was sent by the Most High, but King Solomon didn't know this. And he said, well, Solomon, I'll tell you what my powers are if you give me your magic ring. Now, for all of my superhero people out here who are familiar with the Green Lantern and that powerful ring that the Green Lantern had. Also, you had a movie with, I can't remember the character's name, but he wore purple and he had these rings and they were these skull rings. I can't remember the name of the movie right now. But basically, you all are familiar with the Green Lantern, the character with the cosmic character with the green ring. Well, all that comes from the ring of King Solomon, because King Solomon had this powerful ring that was given to him. And this is how he had, all his spiritual abilities and stuff like that. So, this demon knew that that's where all King Solomon's power was. So he said, well, I'll help you out, but you got to give me that ring. So in his ego and in his ignorance, King Solomon did that. And once Solomon agreed that that demon basically took the ring and he threw King Solomon out of Jerusalem. And then he took King Solomon's image and his identity, basically made an imposter version of himself. And then he was now in Jerusalem as if he was King Solomon. So Asmodeus took the image or took the identity of King Solomon and had King Solomon basically thrown somewhere off in the desert. And while King Solomon was in the desert, Asmodeus was in the kingdom of Jerusalem, acting like he was Solomon. So doesn't that sound very, very familiar? This also happened in the same movie Aladdin, the Disney movie Aladdin, when Jafar basically got the powers of the genie, and he took Aladdin when he took the magic, genie bottle, which is the ring, and they took Aladdin, and what did he do? He kicked Aladdin out of the holy city, and Aladdin basically was in the deserts, just like King Solomon was, okay? And while Aladdin was gone, Jafar was ruling as if he was the king. So you see this theme show up a lot, you know what I'm saying, of the Aboriginal man and the trials and tribulations. So the trials and tribulations of the Aboriginal man is also the same story of Aladdin. Remember how Aladdin was a beggar? But he, captured the attention of the royal princess. It's the same story of the Aboriginal man, the same Cinderella story, but just in reverse. Anyway, let's continue. So now we know the story of King Solomon. He's in the desert, he's fucked up, living like a beggar. And then you have this demon that's living in Jerusalem, acting like he's him. So what demon right now is on the planet that has stolen the image of Aboriginal people? And while we are in the deserts living as beggars and peasants, they are living as kings in Jerusalem right now. Who is that people? You just answer that to yourself. Let's continue. Banished from his home, deprived of his realm, Solomon wandered off in far off lands among strangers, begging his daily bread. Nor did his humiliation end there. People thought him a lunatic because he never tired of assuring them that he was Solomon, Judah's great and mighty king. Naturally, that seemed a preposterous claim to the people, the lowest depth of despair he reached. However, when he met someone who recognized him, the recollections and associations that stirred within him then made his present misery almost unendurable. So what happened is King Solomon he's out here in these far off lands, deprived of his realm, banished from his home, among these strangers and begging. And then people are calling him a lunatic because he's telling them, look, y'all, I'm actually King Solomon. I'm just, in the position of a beggar right now, and I've been banished from my own kingdom. I am the great king of Judah. And they just laughing at him. The same way we are as Aboriginal people saying, hey, y'all, that story in the Old Testament about the so-called Israelites, hey, that's our story. Hey, y'all, y'all was trying to figure out who the original Native Americans were. Well, that's us, hey, y'all want to know who the people were that built the Egyptian empire and the pyramids around the world. Hey, that was us. So we telling people this stuff and they just looking at us like we lunatics, laughing at us. You know what I'm saying? No different than they laughed at King Solomon when he was in the desert. It happened that once on his peregrinations, he met one of his old acquaintances, a rich and well-considered man who gave a sumptuous banquet in honor of Solomon. At the meal, his host spoke to Solomon constantly of the magnificence and splendor he had once seen with his own eyes at the court of the king. These reminiscences moved the king to tears, and he wept so bitterly when he rose from the banquet he was satiated, not with the rich food, but with salt tears. The following day it again happened that Solomon met an acquaintance of former days, this time a poor man, who nevertheless entreated Solomon to do him the honor and break bread under his roof. All that the poor man could offer his distinguished guest was a mere dish of greens. But he tried in every way to assuage the grief that oppressed Solomon. He said, O my Lord and King, God hath sworn unto David he would never let the royal dignity depart from his house. But it is the way of God to reprove those he loves if they sinned. Rest assured he will restore thee in good time to thy kingdom. These words of his poor host were more grateful to Solomon's bruised heart than the banquet the rich man had prepared for him. It was to contrast between the constellations of the two men that he applied in the verse of Proverbs. Better is a dish of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred there within. This part was very, very deep. So what we have here is basically King Solomon came across two men that he knew when he was once the king, and they recognized who he was. One of them was a very, very rich man, and he threw this party and was basically saying all the, great things that Solomon did when he was once king. And, Solomon was sitting there hearing all this stuff, and, it made him cry. It just brought him to tears. And another time, it was a poor man, and the poor man didn't have anything but, some greens to offer. But, King Solomon was just real, real depressed. And then the poor man told him that I guess because of some covenant that God made with David, that he would never let the royal dignity depart from his house. But see, what's interesting about a lot of this stuff, and I'm going to kind of digress for a minute here, but, some of the reasons and the issues I have is that when you have to suffer and pay consequences really for something you don't do. I've always had a problem with that in my life. And one thing I've noticed in the Old Testament and in the Bible, the way it works, is that you would have one man commit a sin, and he may not be the one to pay the consequence or pay the price for his sin, but it may be his descendant. So a lot of the times in the Old Testament, the person who committed the sin, they're not the ones that really deal with the consequence. It's usually whoever is in their lineage that comes after them. So by the time it's, the trials and tribulations come off, they either old or they done died off already. And it's just the young people and the new people who are left behind to deal with the bullshit, but they're not even the ones that really created it. And it's like, I just got an issue with that, man. I really, really do. That's why I don't try to create no kind of bad energy or karma for people that come behind me, because I see how that shit works. It's like it just get left on the people behind, and they have to suffer. It's like I think about them bitch ass Moors, let's say, that did have harems and had plush jewelry and gold and all this stuff, and those aboriginals here that had jewelry and gold and was living this kind of way and all this different stuff. It was their fuckery that led to everything falling. And it was so many other aboriginals who were born and died in so-called slavery that lived 80 years, 90 years, 70 years, 100 years, 40 years, 50 years, and their whole life was just suffering. And it was for some shit that they didn't even do, So it's like, that's how you can't say that we're not the damn same people in that Old Testament, man, because we suffer from shit that our forefathers and foremothers did, and a lot of us don't even know what the fuck that shit is. And I have a very, very, very big beef with that, and that's why I digress for a minute. So sometimes I have an issue when it says things like, that God swore unto David he would never let the royal dignity depart from his house. It's like, shit. Never mind, man. Anyway. So moving on. Let me go to the next part. So it says, for 3 long years, Solomon journeyed about, begging his way from city to city and from country to country, atoning for the 3 sins of his life by which he had set aside the commandment laid upon kings in Deuteronomy, not to multiply horses and wives and silver and gold. And the end of that time, God took mercy upon him for the sake of his father David, and for the sake of the pious princess Naamah, the daughter of the king, the Ammonite king, destined by God to be the ancestress of the Messiah. The time was approaching when she was to become the wife of Solomon and reign as queen in Jerusalem. God therefore led the royal wanderer to the city of Ammon. Solomon took service as an underlying, with the cook in the royal house, such as I don't want to read that part. So basically what happened here is that King Solomon just kept, being a beggar, what I'm saying, for 3 whole years. And he eventually came across the city of Ammon. And here, the daughter of the king, which was named Naamah, fell in love with him. And long story short, she was kicked out of the kingdom along with Solomon. And they were banished and driven out. All right. So now we're going to go to the part where Solomon kind of got his stuff back. So it says, the Ammonite king had the 2 lovers taken to a barren desert in hope that they would die of starvation there. Solomon and his wife wandered through the desert until they came to a city situated by the seashore. They purchased a fish to starve off death. When Naamah prepared the fish, she found in its belly the magic ring belonging to her husband, which had been given to Asmodeus, and which, thrown into the sea by the demon, had been swallowed by a fish. Solomon recognized his ring, put it on his finger, and in the twinkling of an eye, he transported himself to Jerusalem. Asmodeus, who had been posing as King Solomon during the 3 years, he drove out and himself ascended the throne once again. So what happened is when King Solomon and his wife, were in the deserts, mind you also too, that a lot of times when the hero or whoever is the king, when he is banished or he's in the state of being down, he's always in some form of a desert. You'll see that theme show up a lot, a desert or a cave, or basically some form of a deep isolation, a very, very deep isolation. I was listening to Kobe Bryant talk earlier in an interview with Shaquille O'Neal, and Shaq asked him, he said, well, where did you get that killer instinct from? Where did that start from? And Kobe said it started from being isolated, because he talked about how when he was a young man, growing up in Italy, and how there was a lot of racism over there, and him being the only, melanated Aboriginal, in the area. And how he just was isolated. And he said the only place he could really get his revenge was on the basketball court. So at some point in the time, any man who becomes a king or an emperor, you will go through some great isolation in your life. I almost kind of said something, but never mind. So moving on. Let's see. So what ended up also happening is that, so him and his wife were starving. And they went and got a fish. So when they went to go and cook the fish, they saw that there was a ring in the stomach. So they ended come to find out this is the same ring that Asmodeus took from Solomon, but Asmodeus ended up throwing it in the ocean. So you also know in the movie Lord of the Rings, you remember in the beginning of Lord of the Rings when those two guys were out fishing and they came across the ring that was at the bottom of that lake or the bottom of the pond. So the ring in the sea or the ring in the ocean is also a theme that you also see a lot. And the one who controls the ring ultimately is the goddess of the sea or the goddess of the waters, which is the Akash. So it's the feminine principle ultimately that holds the ring. That's why it's always in water. Also salute to that person who was talking about the Mare, okay, or the Mariah or the Mary, which all deals with the sea goddess or the water, okay. So we talk about Aboriginal people or even Moors. We're talking about people who are tied to the land and the water, because isn't majority of your body made of water, and isn't the physical material our body made up of coming from earth matter? So when we say Aboriginal people, we're talking about people or basically spirit that is being held together with water and land. Let me repeat that. When we talk about Aboriginal people, we're talking about spirits that are being held together by water and land. All right. So we see that King Solomon retrieved his ring and he put his ring on. And it says that in the twinkling of an eye, he transported himself to Jerusalem. So maybe some of us as Aboriginals, when we retrieve this ring, that in the twinkling of an eye, we'll transport ourselves back to Jerusalem. Or maybe in the twinkling of an eye, we'll gain back the things that we once lost. Who knows, So then it says when he returned that Asmodeus, who had been posing as King Solomon, he flew out. So then it says that Solomon succeeded in regaining his throne only after undergoing many hardships. The people of Jerusalem considered him a lunatic because he said that he was Solomon. After some time, the members of the Sanhedrin noticed his peculiar behavior and they investigated the matter. They found that a long time had passed since the confidant of the king had been permitted to enter the presence of the usurper. Furthermore, the wives of Solomon and his mother Bathsheba informed them that the behavior of the king had completely changed. It was not befitting royalty and in no respect like Solomon's former manner. So while Solomon was going and you had Asmodeus being the fake version of him in the kingdom, some of the people was noticing like, wait a minute, something ain't right. King Solomon's mom noticed that something wasn't right. And some of his wives who were still in the kingdom, They noticed that something wasn't right. And then he goes on to say that it was also very strange that the king never by any chance allowed his feet to be seen. Of course, betraying his demonic origin. So that was another thing. See, Asmodeus didn't want nobody to see his feet when he was in the kingdom because he still had the feet of a demon. All right. So he really wasn't King Solomon. He just was pulling this trick on everybody. And then it says the Sanhedrin therefore gave the king's magic ring to the wandering beggar who called himself King Solomon and had him appear before the pretender on the throne. As soon as Asmodeus caught sight of the king's it says, as soon as Asmodeus caught sight of the true king protected by his magic ring, he flew away quickly. And then it says that the sight of Asmodeus and all his forbidding ugliness had so terrified Solomon that he sought to surround his couch at night with valiant heroes. So what ended up happening is that King Solomon came into court, and as soon as Asmodeus saw him, the imposter, he flew away in fear. So, so that means that when a lot of the aboriginals that are in their higher self, with knowledge of self, and they come back in their true identity and their true image, the person who is faking like they are you, they will flee when you come around, and they become uncomfortable when you come around. Okay. So it's a very, very, interesting occult esoteric history behind the fall of Aboriginal people and, the rising of Aboriginal people. All right. But I wanted to just drop this tape because I talked about this one a very, very long time ago. And I guess tonight was the perfect day, or the perfect night to do it, rather. But it's the boy Blackbeard. Y'all stay tuned. I'm out.